Well, once again, I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the Ukrainian Institute of London. We're very glad that we can host Archbishop Borys. In many ways, I'm going to say something that I hate it when it's said. This is a man who really needs no introduction, but just in case somebody doesn't know who Archbishop Borys is, I'd like to remind you of that. Archbishop Borys was born in the United States, in Syracuse, and grew up really in the shadow and in the warmth and gentleness of our late Patriarch Joseph Slipe. He was, met him as a very young boy, I think, when he came to Syracuse and presented him with maybe flowers or something like that. There's a wonderful photograph somewhere floating out there in the Ethernet somewhere. But he also studied in Rome, where Patriarch Joseph lived, a student there. He grew up to be a wonderful person. My first real experience of Archbishop Borys was way back in the last century, in 1990, when Patriarch Miroslav Ivan asked us who were part of his Rome staff to organize a trip of journalists to Ukraine at Easter period in April of 1990 to see what this glasnost and perestroika was all about, was it working, and of course to test by visiting the church to see how it was going. And we had about 30 international journalists with us, and the Cardinal's, the Patriarch's press secretary at the time, Sonia Hlikoska, organized this. She asked me to come along with them as a newly ordained priest, and we needed 3 translators to help us with the various language groupings of the journalists. So we had somebody that spoke Spanish and someone who spoke English and Italian and French and German and all of these things. And so we had 3 wonderful translators. One of them is Father Mikhailo Demid, who was really one of the first pro-rector or rector of, at that time, the Lviv Theological Academy in the early 1990s. And another one is now a priest as well, Father Dr. Anibal Solkus, a canon lawyer. And the other one was a student, Borys Gudziak. And he really did some amazing things during that visit. But one of the things that made me realize who this person is, he came up to me and he said, you know, we should organize a Youth for Christ rally here in Lviv. And I said, what are you talking about? How are we organizing Youth for Christ rally? No, now's the time, and we can do it. We'll do it in September of this year. And he helped organize this fabulous Youth for Christ rally in Lviv in September of 1990. It was a spectacular event. It was really something that I would say showed people in Ukraine what they could do even in the Soviet Union. He is not a man who lacks courage. He inspired me to do things that I probably would not have normally done. At the beginning of the Revolution of Dignity, both Archbishop Borys and myself were in Kiev at meetings, but just outside of Kiev, and we came to the Maidan just as things were starting way back in December. And we had a liturgy in a makeshift chapel in a tent, and we came out, and our car was parked where the statue of Lenin had been, across from Bessarabsky Bazaar. And I thought we would turn and go towards the car, but Archbishop Borys said to me, "Ken, let's go talk to the Biblicot." And I was looking at this, and he said, no, come on, let's do this. And so there was the demonstrators right here on the line, then there was sort of like about this much distance, sort of no man's land, and then the Biblicot. And I said, what are we going to say? Just say, don't do this. What are your grandchildren going to say about you? And just go down the line. So there we were going down the line of this. And it was frightening, but Archbishop Borys that was there with me and gave me courage to do these things too. Archbishop Borys is the Metropolitan Archbishop of Philadelphia for Ukrainian Catholics in the United States. He also has a few other titles, President of Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. He was also one of the people who helped organize it from the very beginning. I actually was at one of the earliest meetings where he and a few other people were, and I was the first Vice Chancellor of the Archieparchy of Lviv, and everybody was saying how this was Patriarch Yosef's dream, that we need to follow this, etc., etc. And then all of a sudden, people turned to me and says, "Well, what's your thoughts, Father Kenneth?" And I said, "You know, we have to really be careful. This isn't like a soup kitchen for the poor, where you give food and then the next day you're saying, sorry, we ran out of food. We're asking people to give up their lives to go to a real university to come and study here. And then what happens? They let me talk, and then they just ignored me. I realized that I either get on the bandwagon with this or I don't. And, you know, once again, Archbishop Borys encouraged me. He's also the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church's Department for External Affairs, so very much a person who is the voice of our church to not only governments and other denominations. And he's also a member of the Permanent Synod, which is 4 bishops that are elected by the Great Synod to be advisors to our Patriarch and have meetings with him at least 4 times a year. And a very close and good friend of mine. And so it is with great pleasure that I want us to welcome Archbishop Borys, Metropolitan of Ukrainian Catholics in the United States.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be back in London. When I was in Paris, I had the privilege of coming here a few times a year, and it's been a long time since the last visit. And it's wonderful to enjoy Bishop Ken's hospitality. I wish all of you sometime get a chance to have one of his gourmet meals and just enjoy his company. He's somebody that has done amazing things in our church. He totally revitalized the eparchy in Vancouver, in British Columbia. He's led the pastoral planning of our church, and I think he's going to do great things here with the community and for the community. So I hope you can support him. I'm very grateful to the Ukrainian Institute of the Ukrainian Catholic University, to Olesya, the other officers, to the trustees led by Robert Brinkley. I'm also grateful to the St. Sophia Society, which is a patron of the Institute, and also community leaders and all people of goodwill that are gathering today or might be listening eventually online. I'd like to greet Marina, who has done such a yeoman's job for the Institute in a very crucial time. A talk is bad. It can be defined as bad if you kind of fall asleep in it. You know, if somebody's giving a talk and you fall asleep. But a really bad talk is when the person that falls asleep is the speaker. I'm a little jet-lagged. In a very interesting conversation with Bishop Ken, I fell asleep yesterday. And since I hope to just introduce a conversation between friends today, please throw something at me if I fall asleep. We're all living in a moment of tension. in a time of tension, in a world of tension. Some of us have a longer memory. Kind of look back and think, what's going on? The populism, the post-truth approach, the alternative facts arguments, the discord among allies, the division of societies, the progressive loss of common denominators, things that make language understandable, meaningful, an instrument of communication, maybe even inspiration. What I'm hoping is that in a very modest way at least, all of us can emerge tonight from this encounter a little bit uplifted at a time of a lot of anxiety for all people connected with things Ukrainian, whether it's Ukrainians or friends of Ukrainians. And so I propose to share some preliminary thoughts, and then I hope we can open up the floor for questions, interjections, expression of experiences. The Institute is an academic institute. It pursues things intellectual, but it also is a service institution. It has as its goal to help people, and I propose that we help each other at this time. Yesterday was a very special day when, on the basis of the appeal of His Holiness Pope Francis, all Catholics were summoned to pray for Ukraine, and all people of goodwill were invited to join, and some of us had an opportunity to do so together. And I think millions did globally. And here in London, I was really warmed by the solidarity that people in London showed at the time of this appeal. From hour to hour, from day to day, we don't know what will happen. And I think we share and know the background, but some things are good to repeat. Ukraine and Ukrainians have been experiencing and actually promoting and driving an incredible process in their history. Last summer we celebrated the 30th anniversary of independence. The Ukrainians, I believe, before that were the biggest ethnic group in the world not to be independent. I think it's the Kurds now that didn't have a state of their own. That declaration of independence was preceded by more than 3 centuries of Russian rule of one or other part of Ukrainian ethnographic territory in what is today the political state of Ukraine. And so there was a dramatic change in 1991, something that very few expected, very few predicted. Those who remember those events and follow them closely will recall that at the beginning of August, President George Bush Sr. visited Ukraine and warned the people to avoid suicidal nationalism. Separatism was not in the best interests of Ukrainians. It wasn't in the best interest in the formula of the balance of powers. It wasn't in the best interest of humanity in general. Ukrainians shouldn't have independence, in other words. It was only a matter of days before that independence was declared. I know the church was not ready for it. The church was caught in many ways flat-footed, whether it's the Holy See or even our church. And if we look back in our own minds, those old enough to think about it, very few people could have predicted it. I think it was a miracle, besides having explanations that can be formulated based on politics, economics, military issues, ethnic questions, national aspirations. I want to start with this and end with this, that we're at the cathedral where we prayed yesterday because we believe that people are created in the image and likeness of God, that they have dignity, that they have freedom that nobody has the right to alienate. And that what we are seeing in the headlines of our newspapers or on our screens is a struggle for this independence, a struggle for this freedom, and a struggle against this freedom. A struggle for this dignity and a struggle against it. It's a question of ideas and ideals. First of all, it's not first of all a question of NATO or missiles, Black Sea ports, or the protection of Russians or Russian speakers in Ukraine. The great fear of President Putin and his governing elite is that this arduous, winding, but in the end fruitful process of Ukraine's fostering democracy might spread into the Russian Federation. It needs to be stopped, and stopped at a distance. It needs to be stopped in Georgia. It needs to be crushed in Belarus. It needs to be snuffed out in Kazakhstan. But most importantly, and most dangerously, it is appearing in Ukraine, and finally, it needs to stop. President Putin, in the 22 years of his governance as President and Prime Minister of Russia, has had many successes. He talks about them, and I'm sure he has a long list. I'd like to give you a list of his two greatest failures. And I think that was the Orange Revolution and the revolution of dignity and its aftermath. Like those who didn't expect Ukrainian independence, the resilience of the population of Ukraine, its growing unity was something that President Putin and the Russian leadership did not expect. Ukraine was in many ways on its knees. 8 years ago. If you recall, at the time of independence, there were 900,000 troops of the Red Army stationed in Ukraine who became the first members of the armed forces of a newly independent country. By March 2014, there were only 16,500 6,000 battle-ready troops left when the annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass began. In 1990, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in Ukraine. No real intention to use it, not having an easy capacity to, let's say, make it usable. But Ukraine set precedent by becoming the first country to ever unilaterally disarm its nuclear arsenal, receiving guarantees from, in various forms, from the United States, Russia, but also, I think, Great Britain and France, with a consensus of other Western nations, guarantees of territorial integrity. Independence went forward, kind of a messy democracy, developed a legacy. Over 30 years, 6 presidents elected, opposing parties, changing parties and even ideological orientations, changing their governments and having seats of power. Not neat, stumbling, marked by corruption, but moving forward, learning. I remember when at a press conference, the late great Cardinal Lubomir Huzar was being criticized for the state of the clergy, the post-Soviet Ukrainian Catholic clergy. Many things to complain about. And his reticent response was, let people grow in their freedom. Let people grow in their freedom. It's not perfect, but it's real, and ultimately it's prophetic. It's what is true about human beings. To be free and to live with dignity. As Ukrainians were electing third, fourth, fifth, sixth president, next door we saw presidential elections where a president never loses. We saw internal civil wars. We saw a noose being pulled on the neck of the press. Increasingly evident was the desire not to move forward, but to return. A nostalgia for imperial glory was increasingly an argument for authoritarian rule. And the fact that just next door there was a vibrant democracy with a very active civil society, filled with NGOs setting up checks and balances, more or less effective for those in positions of political power. This presence in the neighborhood caused fear and aggression in the Russian leadership. Unfortunately, from the men and women of the cloth, this nostalgia was encouraged. And we have precious few prophetic voices today in the Russian Orthodox world calling for peace and calling out those who purvey violence. And the question for me, day in, day out, through these 8 years, I think is the question of many Ukrainians and friends of Ukrainians. One that it's difficult to pose on a daily basis, but maybe it's good to pose it together, is how to deal with this. What can we do? It's a terrible thing. You are an audience that is close to an author that has eloquently described the personal drama of what this kind of aggression and violence means. I hope all of you have heard about Olesya Khrumichuk's book about her brother, and I hope you can purchase it and share it with others, because it illustrates what is happening today. Our question is, how long will this violence continue? How long will the killing continue? How many orphans, how many impoverished widows, how many destroyed houses, homes, churches, synagogues, Muslim places of worship? How many roads will be destroyed? Schools? How much of the infrastructure of a country? How much will the population be impoverished? If the partial occupation of 2 of the 25 Ukrainian oblasts and the annexation of Crimea produced somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million internal refugees, what will happen if 10 oblasts are occupied? Will there be 4, 5, 6 or more million refugees? How many of them will be crossing the EU border? I think it is an incredible sign of maturity and charity that neither Europe nor the world speaks about the internal refugees of Ukraine. They've been absorbed. There's no refugee camps. At least not in our consciousness. There are people who are living in camp-like circumstances as internally displaced refugees. BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, at the end of 13, at the beginning of 2014, were showing us these maps with electoral percentages and saying, this is a divided country. A country divided between the Ukrainian speakers and English speakers. Confession. And then the truth began to emerge. A plurality of the defenders of Ukraine's independence and its territorial integrity turned out to be Russian speakers. A majority of those killed by Russian forces, if belonging to any church, were members of the Russian Patriarchate. So in fact, there's a lot of questions. Is there any truth at all to the fact that President Putin is defending Russians in Ukraine, Russian speakers, members of the Russian Orthodox Church? And what is it that possesses somebody that has hegemony over a landmass that extends across 11 time zones? What possesses a person to want more? These are some of the questions that Ukrainians and friends of Ukrainians have. And what can we do? I think it's extremely important to be informed. I think it's important to have answers to these questions for ourselves and for other people of goodwill. Because this is not a war just of arms, tanks, guns, snipers, generals. But this is a hybrid war in which there is a concerted, strategic attempt to undermine the economy. And that has been done quite effectively when already in 2014, Ukrainian currency lost 2/3 of its value. When the price of the dollar changed from 8 to 25 hryvnias. Instantaneously, most Ukrainians lost 2/3 of the value of their savings and of their salaries. It's an economic war. Markets, energy resources. It's a cyber war. January 14th, many government websites were and communication instruments were invaded. And over the years, it's happened many times. We can only imagine if U.S. institutions, U.S. political parties, American businesses can be hacked. What degree of cyber attack is being directed at Ukrainian businesses, political institutions, NGOs, anybody that is in opposition to the intentions of the Russian Federation regarding Ukraine. So it's very important to be informed. And I salute many of you who are in the forefront, in the avant-garde of informing the world, here in one of the media capitals of the globe, London. We can help. There's nothing more energizing than when we help somebody in need. And we're never wrong when we help somebody in need. Giving many interviews daily on both sides of the Atlantic in the last few days. I'm at pains to explain to a surprised public that is discovering that there's a war in Ukraine. And I say, you know, every one of our parishes, with great regularity, has been trying to help out. Helping soldiers with amputated legs to get prosthetic devices. Helping those who have injured eyes receive sophisticated operations. Helping orphans, widows, helping young people who are helping others to rebuild their homes. And I think for all of us that have had the privilege to be involved, it's a very good way to deal with this tension and this anxiety. For me personally, and I share it with you with a gentle recommendation, it's most important also to realize that there's a Lord above us. All of us have a beating heart. Somebody wound it up. It just kind of keeps beating even when we're not thinking about it. We have a beautiful world, a bright sun, life-giving water. We have our relationships, a great variety and richness of our neighbors, members of our family, and it's all a gift. Ukrainian independence is something that many have given their lives for. In these 8 years of war, over the previous 80 and maybe 800 years. Many of us here present have relatives who sacrificed their life or whose life was sacrificed for these ideals of freedom and dignity. And somehow 30 now, it'll be soon 31 years ago, this people, this land, this nation, this conglomerate of people in solidarity became free. The country welcomed the Muslims who had been deported in an act of ethnic cleansing in 1946, deported from Crimea to Siberia. The country, more recently, country labeled often in historiography and in the public mind as a country of anti-Semites, elected a president who was Jewish. And for a while there, if we remember, besides Israel, Ukraine was the only country that had a head of state and a head of government, both of whom were Jewish. President Zelensky and Prime Minister Groysman. It's probably the only country in the world that has an active council of churches and religious organizations that meet with regularity, not to fight about the differences in their creed and doctrine, but to find consensus on social issues. All of the churches stood for nonviolence at the time of the Maidan. All of the churches condemned the rhetoric about the division of the country. And all of the churches promoted a path of dialogue in addressing the critical and divisive issues in Ukraine. For 25 years, the Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations has been a unique instrument of social and religious encounter and dialogue. I think these are miracles. I think they're fruits of God's grace. And so I share with you the freedom to pray, to open up our lives to God's presence, the giver of life, the giver of these gifts. For us Christians, just emerging out of the celebration of the Nativity, we still carol about and sing of the Prince of Peace. We sing of this mystery of God becoming man. We sing about this paradox of the Almighty becoming completely vulnerable. It's idyllic. It's the fantasy of our childhood. And yet it is marked by the great distress of a mother giving birth in difficult circumstances, of the bewilderment of a father, of the violence of a hysterical despot that pathetically clings to his power and is willing to kill children, to kill the little Prince of Peace. It's a story of refugees. But most importantly, it's a story of great solidarity of God with the human race. And so if we inform each other, if we listen critically and speak out truthfully, if we help, and if we pray, we suddenly see that this time is a time of great opportunity. The anxiety can be converted into energy that uplifts, that supports. So I'm very grateful to all of you because I think all of you are here out of concern. And all of you have in your heart a great desire for charity. Thinking of how can we help at this time? What can we do? And you're doing it. And I know that after our conversation I will emerge, and after my visit of London I will leave greatly encouraged. Because this is a country, this is a society that is taking a stand and making a contribution and giving Ukrainians hope. Here, at this hour, on that cold front, in those deep dugouts, for those mothers who have sleepless nights, for the young people that look to the West and say, we're going to build here at home what you have shown us abroad. So I invite you to share what you're living, what you're thinking, what your questions may be, and I hope we can have a little discussion that will contribute to our sense of solidarity and our confidence that peace can be preserved and that freedom and dignity will be fostered. Is it now 8 o'clock? Okay. So, sure.
So the Ukrainian Institute this evening recognizes the plight of all those who had to suffer through the Holocaust. At 8 o'clock this evening, across Britain, everyone is lighting a candle for the survivors, for those who were victims. The reason I am so emotional is that I only found out a few months ago that my grandfather died at Sachsenhausen. He too was a victim. He was the son of a Ukrainian Catholic priest. My great-grandfather, Petro Gudziak, had 10 children. He was a Ukrainian patriot. He was a member of Prosvita. He was sent to Siberia during the First World War. He came back to Ukraine and was fortunate enough to see the beginning of the first Ukrainian Republic, the first independence of Ukraine in 1918. He passed away from typhoid in 1919. One of his sons, Ivan Rudikevich, my grandfather, subsequently obviously had my father, was sent as a forced laborer in 1940 to Germany, and in his last year of life he was in forced labor and concentration camps. I have been tracking his history, and I spent some time in the Arleston archives. I'm very grateful that the Jewish nation people and Germany as well, has kept the stories alive, because that is how many of us Ukrainians can find our relatives. I think if we speak of human dignity, if we speak of compassion and solidarity, we mustn't forget that there are many who have already suffered what Ukraine has suffered and worse. And so I hope that this evening we will remember them. Thank you.
Maybe we can take a moment of silence. Thank you. So I invite all of you into a discussion.
If you want to just raise your hand and maybe introduce yourselves, if that's all right, and ask a question, please do so.
Please stand up.
Thank you very much for the talk, and really appreciate you being with us today. My question is, in the time of in times like this, in the times of great atrocities that are committed against us, when we face blatant lies, when we face anger, when we face violence, when it's, to be honest, natural to not only have your faith in God tested, but faith in humanity as well. How do we manage and contain to be at the same time a good Christian and have the values that and the moral values that make us good Christians and manage to be a good Ukrainian as well? And I'll explain what I mean in terms of how do you manage to have faith, how do you manage to have hope and peace at times when it's natural as a Ukrainian to feel anger, to be scared in light of violence, and to be honest, feel urged to reciprocate that violence. How can we be, or is it possible to be a good Christian and a good Ukrainian at a time of war?
In I think, circumstances of distress, and of course there are different kinds of distress and different circumstances that provoke it. But when we are distressed by outside agents, by particular people, one bit of advice given to me by a wise person was the following: don't give that agent of your distress more power over you than he or she has, or that he and she can grab or maybe is entitled to. Because sometimes we might be in family situations where somebody has, or work situations where somebody has authority over us in a legitimate way. I think it's very important to work on our life of the Spirit. And to do that, we need to kind of remind ourselves that is at the heart of our life. that we have a spirit. I think that's one of the issues that really are emerging in a very powerful way in the 21st century in the Western world. Most people say, or increasingly many people say, I don't know if there's a spirit. I don't know who I am. I know the body. I know the mind. I know the psyche. But is there more? Will there be more? Will my death be a black pit, a dark hole? And in light of that, what meaning does my limited life have? For, answer your question, for a Christian, we Christians are called to live with a great hope. It's an incredible hope. It's a transcendent hope. The hope is that you and I are called to live, that we're given life, and that we will live. Death notwithstanding. For me personally, the prospects of eternal life are something that I hope is influencing my life here and now. And Jesus' announcement of the kingdom was not about something that, you kind of tough it out now, slog through, and then somewhere, sometime, after you croak, there'll be a reward. It begins here and now. Jesus says the kingdom is here and now. And, it's moments like right now. Whether it's with people that have an explicit faith or an implicit one, or maybe no faith at all, that there is a great solidarity. There's a sympathy, something that transcends the body, the mind, the psyche. I think when we open our lives to its great mystery, to the power of memory. You shared with us a history that you didn't have an active memory of, a history that appeared, a connection, a relationship that today moves you to tears. And if we can tell the enemy of mankind, the killer, the deceiver, the evil one, that's your place. Get behind me, Satan. And claim our freedom. For me, the beatification in 2001 by St. John Paul II of the 25 Ukrainian martyrs was an incredible moment. I studied their history, coordinated an oral history project that assembled over 2,000 interviews with survivors of the underground religious experience, and it today amounts to 150,000 pages of transcribed testimony. It's like 500, 300-page books. I don't know how many, it'd probably take 20 years to read it. I haven't read it all. But in the center of it all, of the icon, of the story, is, for example, the monk Clement Sheptytsky, the brother of the more famous Andrei, who died in a solitary cell in the Vladimir prison. And in the 1990s, Father, today Bishop Teodor Martiniuk, went searching for any last kind of evidence of how was his experience. How did he live and die those last few years in a Stalinist prison? This man who was an aristocrat, who was from a billionaire family, who was known as a great dandy, who has the best shoes in Galicia, who had been a member of the Austrian parliament, and who turned away from all that to become a Studite monk. An abbot, known for washing the toilets of novices, of village boy novices. If you know what aristocrats were like and what pre-modern village boys were like, some of it we saw in the 80s and 90s in Soviet washrooms. A man of utter humility, who had it all and left it all, and then was deprived of anything else he had. Any fellowship, any opportunity to pray in a church. And Teodor Martiniuk found an old woman who in the late 40s, as a girl in her late teens or early 20s, was employed in this prison to carry food to the prisoners. He could tell her when Sheptytsky was there, and she told him about her impressions of this man. Every time she came to that prison, he was looking out the window in peace, in a state of tranquility, knowing that he has no chance. He's condemned. He's going nowhere. His freedom, the freedom of his body, has been deprived. And yet she testified to his great peace and his great dignity. Oh yeah, the man with the big beard. I remember him. This is what he was like. I share with you an image, an icon of somebody that gives me sustenance when I get frazzled and upset, and when my fear leads to aggression. It's a grace, but we can ask for it. And if you look towards the saints as models, if you look upon the cross as a Christian, and ultimately look at your persecutors, look at your Annas and Caiaphas, the Roman soldiers and Pilate, as if you were Jesus, you will be able to forgive. You will be able to have peace. And even if they kill you, you're going to rise again. Knowing that in advance, you will live in a different way. I mean, that's what I would hope to do, but I'm struggling for that vision and for that posture.
Yeah, thank you for your talk this evening. I'm not Ukrainian, you can understand by my accent. I'm not even from London, so that's another thing. But I have been to Ukraine, and I've been to orphanages. I struggle at times because sometimes I still see the faces of them children and what's going on in the present. I also get annoyed and angry with the West. There's something you spoke about 3 years ago. I was talking to some friends about Ukraine and they didn't realise the war was going on in the East. It's taken 8 years for the West to wake up to what is actually happening. And it's hard enough to hate somebody. I think President Putin is the biggest liar. He's a Pinocchio of the leaders of the world. But I was reminded this week of the late Jimi Hendrix when he said, when the power of love overcomes the love of power, we will have peace. And I really hope that will happen, especially for Ukraine at this time, and for my friends, not friends who are Ukrainians. I live in the northeast of England, so I'm out of it. I just look in. I worry, I have concerns, because I love the country. I was hoping to go back to Ukraine.
You will.
Fingers crossed we will.
I'm going on Monday.
But I do believe that Ukraine will cease to be a country, but will become a nation. And I honestly, truly believe the will of God that will happen.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for your witness and your love. And the country has never been as united. Never in its history has it been as united as it is today. So it's an opportunity for that kind of love to emerge. But that opportunity needs to be realized. You have to grab it. Marina? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
World Cup of Look, AUGB London branch. Just comment on your introduction to your speech this evening. You talked about miracles and Ukrainian independence being like some kind of miracle happening, but surely countless generations that had faith in the Lord, had faith in their own spirit, had faith in their own meaning, that independence happened because of that. Surely miracles happen unexpectedly, but generation of Ukrainians, as I mentioned earlier, who had those three meanings, that was the end result, Ukrainian independence. Surely, where do miracles and then faith square up to each other?
Well, I think this, the question is when they stopped squaring each other, or in our eyes, when we started to distinguish and distance them. We are all beholden to, science and the scientific method. I was a biologist by first training and spent my whole life developing academic, intellectual institutions, most of my life. So I'm very committed to fostering reason and critical method, inquiry, questions, etc. But I think we've been impoverished in some sense when our rationality has been fanatical in so-called demythologizing, which in many cases leads to a negation of mystery. And if we negate mystery, it's hard to really enjoy it, to be inspired by it. I find myself, when I'm confronted with a long-term deficit in my eparchy, when there's not enough priests to fill the parishes, when the KPIs for, according to the application, the church are not being met. I find that being a modern and even postmodern person, I fled from the tajenstvo. And that's, I think, where we get our answers, the deepest answers to the most difficult questions. So that's why I think song is so important. Maybe we can carol at the end. And maybe our ancestors weren't so primitive. And maybe we can really rejoice in the mystery that is all around us, all the time. With one miracle after another. Marina.
I've just returned from Kiev, spent nearly 2 weeks there, and what really struck me, how different the perception of the situation is in the West and here, in the sense of how much more anxiety you feel when you read Western media and when you see Ukrainian headlines, and then you go to Ukrainian media and there's, very little of that sense of urgency, at least at that point, like 10 years ago. And also what really struck me, how little the people were concerned about what's going to happen. Me coming from London, I felt much more anxious about the whole situation. And typically the argument would go like, we've been at war for 8 years, this is happening already, we are already at war. Do you think it's a sign of maturity or immaturity? What does it say?
Probably both, and even much more. When you have a gun to your head, the first time you feel the cold metal, you maybe fill your diapers, I don't know. But if it's there, day in and day out, you kind of cope. Is it maturity? Could be. Is it denial? Probably. Is there great trauma? In dealing with Ukrainian institutions and in different countries, I served in France, Benelux, and Switzerland for 7 years, working with Ukrainian immigrants, some refugees, but also with those that had been there into a third generation, working with many institutions in North America, specifically the US, but also in Canada, and spending more than 20 years in Ukraine. I am convinced that our people carry a great transgenerational trauma. I think the commemoration of the Holodomor is an incredibly therapeutic process. I think our songs are in the minor key because they acknowledge the suffering that occurred. We see how Afro-Americans or Afro-Britons, I imagine, I don't know the situation here well, but I can say about Afro-Americans how 150 years after the abolition of slavery, 50 years after the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, how difficult it is to emerge out of that past experience. I used to be skeptical about things like ethnopsychology. I'm less skeptical now. I don't, let's say, pontificate about it, but I think our songs are often mournful because millions of Ukrainians were taken into the slave trade, in the Muslim slave trade to Istanbul. Millions over the years. It was an annual seasonal harvest. Those young boys that became janissaries and those beautiful Ukraine girls that knock you out, as the Beatles sang. In Rohatin, there's a big statue of Roxolana. Anybody that has driven through Rohatin recognizes that. And for me, she became the wife of Mehmet the Magnificent, I think, right? I forgot which one. Suleiman, right? Suleiman the Magnificent, right? And I wrote about these things, but I can't remember what I wrote. We'll attribute it to jet lag, not to age. But it's incredible what this resilient nation has gone through. And I think there's coping mechanisms. I find hosting many international scholars and student exchanges, etc., it was interesting to observe how, for example, I remember one Italian, he came real excited. We had, kind of good orientation, introductory discussions, and he was actually housed in my personal apartment, my apartment. I had moved and this apartment was vacant. It was right there by the post office in na ulici Slovacko, right in smack in the center of the city. And it had, like all of those Austrian buildings, it had one of those stoves. And I think I went away for a day and came back, and my secretary, he says, "Here are the keys to your apartment." Giovanni, the night before, was trying to light the stove, and it exploded. If you don't do it with the first and the third and the sixth match, and you don't turn off the gas, it accumulates. And then if you do it with the eighth match, there's a bit of a delight there. And he did it in such a way that the whole thing just was shattered. And when I came into the apartment, pieces of this stove were all over the floor. And within 24 hours, he was on a plane and went home. I mean, these are the kind of things that Ukrainians live with every day, and they deal with it. They deal with it. That's why I think Ukrainians have difficulties with long-range systemic things, because systems don't work, you don't trust them, you don't invest in them, you carpe diem, you grab things, and post-Soviet, post-totalitarian populations, and there's about 2 billion of them between Albania and Estonia, Vietnam and China. That's how they have to think, or they thought because they had to think. Because that's the way you survive. That's the way you live. I think have a perspective that we might not have. But I don't know, maybe that you joyfully have lost. we'll see who's right. You know, whether that seeming nonchalant attitude is really the best way to approach these kind of crises.
We've got a question over there. Let's the lady.
Good evening, my name is Harold Binger. I'm myself not Ukrainian, but I've been working in Ukraine, in Lviv, for many, many years. Archbishop Gudziak.
Well, say something about your institute or the city of Lviv.
I created an institute for urban history in Lviv, and now I'm creating an art center in Lviv as well. And so I know Ukraine from the Lviv perspective very much. But my intention tonight, where we are all very much worried, is just to add even more optimism to our mood, because I've experienced how much this country has changed, and how much potential there is especially in the young generation, and how much inner power there is, which sometimes actually societies in the West lack, because we are in a way spoiled very much by everything we've got. We tend to complain. What I've experienced there, they are ready to really commit to their aims, and are ready to undertake incredible things, and willing to learn, and willing to be open. And I can just say it's amazing what they've achieved, all the people I've been working with, and they show the world how good Ukraine is. And I think the problem is not that Ukraine is sort of, as Russia always says, a failed state and whatever, not a nation. That's obviously not true. What we have to do is to show the world that that's not true. And for that we need just good channels. We need to have a smart leadership, obviously, but basically through initiatives in the country, show the world what Ukraine can achieve. And yeah, so once this is over, I mean, in a way, maybe it will, I don't know, it will never be over because there is this neighbor, but I think it strengthens the country as well. It strengthens the country inside, it consolidates, it encourages the people to think as a nation. And I think these days have also shown that there is international solidarity. And Ukraine is back on the map. I've never heard or read so many contributions in the media about Ukraine, and bringing Ukrainian voices in the media, in the Western media. So all of that is a positive side effect of this crisis, and I hope that in the end this will prevail. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree. No crisis should be wasted. We should make the best of it. Yeah. And thank you for the work that you do in Lviv.
Thank you very much. I have a question about guilt, and I'm Ukrainian. I'm from Dnipro. My grandmother, who was raising me up, she went through the Second World War, and she managed to escape concentration camp twice, actually. My father lived in Crimea, and when the annexation happened, so Russian racketeers, or whoever that was, they took all his business, and he wasn't able really to cope, and in 2016 he died from acquired epilepsy, which was a bit weird in itself. But I ask about guilt because I'm living here, and every time when I speak to my friends or family in Ukraine, I feel that I can't really, I can't even say that I'm worried or like about my anxiety, or because I always hear those people, they kind of already came through so much more, and now they're there. So, and then the second part of my guilt is also that sometimes I feel that obviously I care a lot about people, but then I also strangely, like when I think about that land where I was raised up, and you know, like how I dream to return to Crimea, for example, or like the steppes near Dnipro, and I feel that I actually care so much about the land itself. And so I was just wondering, like, yeah, what's your perspective on that as well?
Well, you know, guilt, I think, has earned a bad reputation. It would be a good thing for Mr. Putin, for example, you know, a sense of guilt. And I think our fear of guilt keeps a lot of evil from happening when our conscience speaks to us and we listen to it. But in your situation, which, you know, I thank you for opening, so, you know, your vulnerability before a public gathering. I would return to those 3 points that I suggested. Really try to inform others if you can. Try to write. Try to speak. Participate in events that bring the news to a greater public, and I know in the past, and I imagine in the future, there will be certain manifestations here in London. Try to, if you're not already engaged in a humanitarian project. There is great need, and you can help, and we all can help. And recognize that you have great dignity. Recognize the mystery of your being. Recognize the gift of your life. When we recognize our gift, we realize that we are gifted. That, you know, it's like on a birthday when people give you gifts, you feel gifted. I mean, you feel rich. A person that recognizes their gift has a heart full of gratitude. And guilt is kind of, it's kind of a heavy experience, one that I don't want to condemn and deny, but one that shouldn't be the dominating, experience of our inner life. Challenge your guilt with gratitude, and you will see that you're not alone, that there's a giver who gives to you. In that position, the answers will come. How to inform, how to get involved, how to help. You're in a great place where people in Dnipro need an ambassador.